And he asked me a question, and he asked me, how would you like to be a cancer advocate? And I know you said don't curse on your show, but I want you to Jon Stewart bleep this. Because I said, what the is a cancer advocate? I swear to God, those words made no sense to me. And here's where everything pivoted. He said to me, you can make the next you have a less crappy time. I said, sign me up. And it was from that moment on in 2000, again, the legend, 4, 5, 6-ish, that I became part of his world. He brought me into the Livestrong heyday with all the yellow wristbands and all the fanfare. And that was what got me cooking with gas and caused me to start Stupid Cancer in 2007. And I'm happy it's happening, and I think it's another sign of the times that we are ripe for a cancer rights revolution.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Genetics for Healthcare. This is a podcast that is dedicated to helping patients and their caregivers advocate for a precision medicine approach to their healthcare, which includes disease screening, treatment, and survivorship. You can find us at geneticsforhealthcare.com. And while you're on that website, please subscribe. And then you can go to any of our social media platforms and follow us, especially on YouTube, so you can get amazing notifications of new episodes like this one. And I got to tell you that I'm really excited and really fortunate and grateful to have our next guest. He is a patient advocacy champion, and he happens to be the host of the longest running independent healthcare podcast, I guess we can say, in the world there, right? Helping pharmaceutical and healthcare industry keep the patient at the center of everything they do. Matthew Zachary, thank you for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
Absolute pleasure, my friend. Thank you for having me on.
So I got to tell you, I listened to your podcast. I've been following your work from Stupid Cancer to Out of Patients, your new podcast, and a lot of the work you're doing. And I like tapping into your rage. And I'll be honest with you, because working in the industry and working with providers to adopt these new tools that have, never been on the market before, and dealing with a lot of, opposition, skepticism, as you're bringing, in new and innovative tools. I've tend to find middle ground on every issue, but that's not you. Let's dive into your personal experience in your battle with cancer, as many of my guests have battled. You were on your way to Hollywood when cancer impacted your life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, man plants, God laughs. And scene. That was, rarely do you know what you want to be when you were up at the age of 19. And I had been concert pianist, a jazz pianist, musical theater pianist, Broadway pianist, 11 years old, was doing like fun things at school and was doing bar mitzvahs and weddings in high school. I played at a lounge. In college, I was in the jazz band, the orchestra. I was writing for TV and film and undergraduate. And I wanted to be John Williams. Like, who wouldn't want to be John Williams? And I had aspirations to go to a graduate school at USC Film School to study under the late, great Jerry Goldsmith, who ironically was John Williams' mentor, to put it in perspective. And I lost the ability to use my left hand over the course of my senior year. I went misdiagnosed for months at a time. And eventually I was diagnosed with, let's see if you're here in 6 months, brain cancer at 21 years old in January of 1996.
Even at that time, with most cancers, there was really no option for care, right? You were going to get surgery if they could, and you're going to get chemotherapy regardless. But what struck me about how you share your story is that even, as an adolescent, your dad, you guys advocated for yourselves in asking them questions and even their offer of chemotherapy.
My dad, he was a public educator. He was an industrial arts teacher, assistant principal, real leader in the community for his entire tenure working for the Board of Ed. And he just had this congenital moxie that most people may not have the benefit of genetically possessing, I suppose, when they walk into this life. He asked questions in defense of my son. What is this? What does this mean? How does this work? Long before the chemotherapy conversation, we had a discussion with the neurosurgeon, who was a mensch and the right person I needed at that moment, as to whether we should have radiation at that particular hospital or not, or go somewhere else in New York City. And we met with the radiation oncologist, the head of radiology, and my dad asked him point blank, how many patients exactly like my son have you done this for? And his answer was 0. We left pretty expediently. I would have not thought to ask that question. I just wanted to be taken care of. And he asked that question. I don't advocate saying no to chemo, but my situation was very bespoke to me. And that story has been very well documented online in what I call the Uncle Jay story, which is when you don't even know you have options, you don't even know what's best for you. How could you?
That's a powerful point.
Yeah. We got very lucky. My father's best friend is Dr. Jay Tishfield, one of the most luminary storied geneticists and pioneers of oncology breakthrough medications you've never heard of before. And he obviously took an active role espying what was happening to me during those first few months. When the conversation came up after radiation was done as to whether or not chemo would be right for me, the doctors at Sloan didn't seem to care what was right for me. They just said, you need to do this. But Jay asked, what specifically are you going to give Matthew? What is this cocktail going to be comprised of? Not that we knew to ask what a cocktail is. Like a Mai Tai with cisplatin in it. And at the same time, like Jay's like, well, you have to tell me. And of course, sharing data in 1996 was not a trend, but he knew the right people. No, it's not. Yeah. He knew the right people. He pulled the strings. We found out that this cocktail was toxic to the point where it would have made me deaf and have permanent neuropathy. The ethics conversation that should have happened that didn't until Jay stepped in, regardless of how much time I have left on this earth. Do I want to compromise the one thing that mattered to me with my identity, which was being a musician and a pianist, and losing my hearing and having neuropathy would guarantee decimating that hope? Am I okay dying earlier and still maintaining my individuality? That's the conversation that matters most to my 30 years alive today. The Forrest Gumpian-like experience I've had since that time really comes back down to that moment of dignity, ethics, and choice.
See, here's why that's so powerful. And you spoke to it in many different ways. Many times when you enter the healthcare system with a condition, many times clinicians don't tell you, hey, here's what's available to you. They will say, here's what we are going to offer you. Matthew, in my experience, my father was a colon cancer survivor, 20-year colon cancer survivor. I started in this industry, 2 years after the mid 2000s, a year after the Human Genome Project completed. So kind of on the early days of launching products, diagnostics that help these clinicians understand what works and what may not work best for a patient. My father had colon cancer. Well, the backbone and the only therapy back then was 5-FU leucovorin. The power of the questions that your dad asked is the type of confidence and moxie that we want to give to those who are watching this, because even though I knew with the best tools we had available that my dad had a favorable genomic profile to respond to therapies that were available, it's not like they told him, what are your goals for therapy, in speaking from provider to patient. To me, that's a big deal, going in and partnering with your doctor for shared decision making, as opposed to saying, well, here's what we're going to give you, even though there might be 3 other options with different side effect profiles, different properties that may fit your lifestyle or your life goals better. You became an advocate, after that, for adolescents and young adults. Was it what was it about the experience that kind of gave you that fire to go be a voice? And for that matter, were you even trying to be a voice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question in the historical context of what got me from X to Y. I didn't just decide to start a charity the day I left the hospital. I spent 10 years just suffering miserably in the wake of nearly dying. I didn't really have a 20s. I lost my career. I lost my passion. As much as I didn't do the chemotherapy, the damage was still there from the tumor compromising my fine motor coordination. So I had to not go to grad school. I couldn't be a composer. I didn't have the skills anymore. I had lost all that training neurologically. And that was catastrophic for a 22-year-old kid to lose his dream. Was I grateful I was alive to have different problems? Of course I was. But what was I going to do with the rest of my life? I was bald. I was impotent. I was neutropenic. I had no white cells. I think that's the same thing. My skin was burned. I was a hairless cat. I had pain, and everything was just, I felt geriatric. What kind of life are you left with when you're cured is another ethical discussion that's tangential to this entire conversation. I kind of wandered the earth like Cain, just figuring out what the hell I can do with myself for a very long time. And it wasn't until I did rehab my piano skills. I was giving concerts here and there, never would be the person I wanted to be. It would have taken 10 more years to bring me back to where I was. And I was giving a concert for the American Cancer Society. And there was someone in the crowd who found me out later, who was on the board of directors of an organization in DC called the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship, which for the listeners, the viewers, it's one of the oldest survivor-led, I think is the oldest survivor-led patient advocate policy group in Washington, NCCS. He was on the board. And he found me, and we had lunch. His name was Craig Lustig, good friend of mine, still a good friend of mine. He asked me a question. How would you like to be a cancer advocate? And I know you said don't curse on your show, but I want you to Jon Stewart bleep this. Because I said, what the is a cancer advocate? I swear to God, those words made no sense to me. He said to me, you can make the next you have a less crappy time. I said, sign me up. And it was from that moment on in 2000, again, the legend, 4, 5, 6-ish, that I became part of his world. He brought me into the Livestrong heyday with all the yellow wristbands and all the fanfare. And that was what got me cooking with gas and caused me to start Stupid Cancer in 2007.
So Stupid Cancer ran for quite a while. I mean, was Stupid Cancer traditional like podcasts? It's podcasts is what we kind of refer to it, but I think you were on terrestrial radio.
Well, it started out as a populist Gen X movement on just getting recognized as a population that gets cancer in the first place. The data back then was that young adults die more, get sick more, have higher morbidities, cost the system more, get different cancers, are misdiagnosed. That just needed to become sort of public health narrative at the populist level. So I built the brand to be that. That came with community engagements and boot camps and all sorts of free internet sort of shenanigans, so to speak. The story of how I got the show came from a mentor of mine I met through Livestrong. Her name was but rest in peace, Selma Schimmel. Selma Schimmel ran the world's first AM terrestrial cancer advocate show in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It was called The Group Room. Pioneer. She was a media person, had cancer in the 80s, beautiful woman, unbelievable spirit and soul of humanity. And she would like schlep her Howard Stern, sorry, they're cursing again, to all the cancer conferences and did like live conversations on site on AM radio of these conferences. And the interviews she did would be put on CD-ROM, and she would give the CD-ROMs to all the attendees to listen to post-event. I met her. We took to each other right away as just like oddball Plutonian orbit advocates in the space. This internet company approached her and said, we would like to take the group room onto the internet. I was like, how does that work? As one would say in 2004, 5,
Exactly.
6. And she said, well, we can take what you do live on AM and we could actually syndicate it less digitally through a streaming platform. Okay, how does that work? And we learned how this was allegedly supposed to be a thing before the word podcast was podcast. Long story short, someone's like, why don't you do a version of the group room? Because it's not going to make sense to take some of the AM on CD-ROM and make it streaming later. So I got the chance to build a streaming radio show that could potentially be on AM, which it was for a very brief point of time. But then it just became like live streaming. If you missed it, you missed it show. Anyone listening that's under 30 years old, yeah, we used to have to wait 20 years for Netflix to air Friends. If you missed it, you missed it. That's what this was. So there was an interesting sort of pre-internet fervor of a live show. It was on AM, I think, for 6 months. And then everyone listening was like our age, like under 30. No one want AM radio. We're going to go on the internet on our dial-up on Mondays at 8 and listen to me yelling at a cloud with guests. That's how that started. The company was called Now Live, and it was billed as a live streaming talk radio broadcast.
Live streaming talk radio broadcast.
Podcast concatenates quite nicely.
Tell me, like, when you started doing that show in, the early days of streaming, right? When people didn't necessarily know how to find you, but of course, when you're speaking to the issues of those who need it, they will find you. How long did you do the show, and what did it do for you as the show grew over the years?
It was like a shiny object. Livestrong talked about it. The American Cancer Society talked about it. So I think I was very intentional in who my first 50 guests were that year, that I wanted them to be part of institutions that could spread the word that there is a streaming talk show about cancer, young adult cancer, and in general. That was mostly entertainment based, because I'm an entertainer and a radio guy trying to talk jargon a little bit. I built the show very much like Fresh Air. The answer to the question is like, I learned how to produce content, but I also learned about the art of radio, and the art of conversation, and the art of theater in audio formats only. No one cares what you have to say until you help them feel something. That's what the show was about. We always started with a bit of a Dennis. Anyone remember like Dennis Miller had his rants during the Dennis Miller Show on HBO? I wrote a 5-minute little rant that just spoke truth. We had a 20-minute interview with someone who dialed in on Skype to talk to a survivor about their insanity. We did a news segment on what's happening around the country. We actually looked at journals and events and what's happening. We did shout outs to community members. And then we just the four of us talked about a specific topic. Very formulaic, very theatrical, very funny. And we were just we had no experience doing this. So my biggest learning, it ran for about, I think, 450 or 500 episodes until I stepped down in 2019. And it became Out of Patience later that year. My biggest takeaway was that people don't want to be pitied. There has to be levity in the narrative. Otherwise, you're just going to be a sad sack. Treating people, not like patients, being empathetic, being honest, being raw, not being jargony, and being antithetical to what people would normally experience in the cancer store, which is boring, pedantic, toxic, masculine, jargony pharma. It was a breath of fresh air for people to hear this. And I've leaned into that with every show. It's about the art of the interview, crafting the narrative, and making sure the listener is the most important person in the room.
In this show, we want to give our listeners the language, the confidence to have conversations with their care providers, whether they're battling chronic disease or they have a loved one who's doing that, to be able to advocate for themselves, right? Over the years, we knew that the technology was going to grow and access was going to become greater, which it has. The utility or the usefulness of all this information is at an all-time high. But still, Matthew, in many situations, genetic and genomic insights, genetic testing, genomic testing to figure out whether you were part of a special group of people who would respond to a drug, right, and have the best chance at response and long-term survival. Still today, it's one of the last things that clinicians consider. We love that there is what we call alternative media. Hey, we got a podcast. There's other ways that you can get this information. In your experience, how important are these alternative means of media, like podcasting, like YouTube, to reach patients who need this information, or to get those folks to connect with advocacy groups to learn about these things that can really help them, that many times their doctors are not having conversations with them about?
All right. So hot take, they're all useless unless asterisk, there's access and awareness to them. And the magic word here is navigation. You don't expect to know what to ask for in a store that carries nothing you ever expected to need. In the moment where you hear the words to then you're in the space, what shows up to help you know things exist? Very rarely nothing. And we always seem so proud to talk about social determinants. I would argue the worst one is search engines. We don't even talk about search engines as a determinant. They're the worst thing in the world because you never know what to trust.
Yeah. Dr.
And,
Google.
This is the best use of the word malarkey. Search engines are pure malarkey. As a consumer person, not a medical person, I would argue that that's the worst intervention you could possibly ever have, is I'm going to check the internet for things. How are you even able to know, to be aware that there is a show or a site or a blog or a feed or a story or a nonprofit or a community? Where are they? They're not searchable. You can't find them. You don't think to look for, I'm going to Google the multiple myeloma dance-off contest party.
Yeah.
That's going to show up. They're only as useful as when they're reaching the people who need to know they exist to digest the content. Really is a needle in the haystack. So I'm in a working mindset now that there has to be a better way to intervene. I'll almost call it the protection side. How do you protect patients in a way that they will be guaranteed to know about these options that may not even be clinical? You're talking practical options, financial options, how to deal with reimbursement issues, how to deal with medical issues, how to deal with mental health issues, how to navigate your family, kids, your fertility, your friends. That's protection that doesn't exist right now to guarantee you know about all this incredible stuff that could be valuable to them.
Do these AI apps make that worse, or is that an improvement upon the search engines?
Again, hot take, I have yet to see them be trained to know about the things that are priorities for patients to learn practically.
We attribute a lot of the lack of testing or the lack of awareness that there are new therapies, there are clinical trials, or there are just tests that can inform patients of their risk of developing a certain disease. It's easy to kind of blame the clinicians, right? Like, your doctor didn't tell you about this. And I've interviewed so many who said, even despite my family history, doctor didn't even ask. He didn't even suggest this. Can we really blame them, though? Can we really blame the doctors? Listen, they got pressure from payers. They got poor workflow systems. Their quality of life sometimes can be patient after patient. I know that's the career they chose, but there's so much friction in the system at which they sit in the center of servicing family members, serving people that we care about. Can we really point the finger at them and say, hey, you guys you're accountable for not growing this and making patients aware of these tests and these genes?
Look, bell curve and bad apples aside, I am pro-Hippocrates. I am pro-medical professionalism. I believe in my heart that everyone who takes that oath does everything in their power every single second of every day to guarantee their patients get and deserve what they need to be who they need to be, survive with dignity, get the right treatments, make the right choices, be as objective as possible. I do not want to believe it's possible for anyone to wake up as a medical professional and say, I'm not going to do that today. It's easy to blame the doctors because you're looking at mental health transference. It's stress. You need a scapegoat. You need to put that energy somewhere. And are there mistakes? Of course, this is human error. There is no 100% for anything else. But there are structures and systems that force Hippocrates to have to bend sometimes against the will of those who wish to practice it earnestly. And that's a kind way of saying it. But the system is not equipped in a way to ensure that what's best for the patient isn't just best for the system.
You had a post mentioning United Healthcare.
My favorite company.
United Care is kind of like the Weeble Wobble, where you back in the day you used to punch the thing, the Weeble might wobble, but they don't fall down. They're easy to punch on because they are the largest healthcare payer network in our country here in the United States. They're laying people off. Earnings 2025, they had over 111 billion with a B in revenue, which was an increase of 13% over this quarter last year. And that equaled somewhere around 3-4 billion in profit. But the profit dropped significantly, right? It dropped to 19% year over year. And the response to that is, cost saving measures that most public companies are going to do, which is, reduction of force, laying people off. Voluntary layoffs. Here's what I'm getting at, Matthew. This is the business of healthcare. We know that they're one of the top revenue, top performing companies in our S&P 500, in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, whatever you want to say. But I think we need a reset in consciousness because in healthcare, yes, laying people off is the response when you have a reduction in profitability. But can we not use our brains and say, hey, if we're going to lay people off of our largest healthcare provider, that means we're going to be less effective in paying for health care claims for the people who need them. They already are on record for not paying for things that people had to darn near revolt about. How do we look at the business of healthcare in its current state and hope that access to care for the people who need it is going to get better?
It's not. It never will. Asterisk. I believe we're at a point in time, a true inflection point. I know that's easy to just use those words out into the ether. I'm unhappy when people continue to believe that healthcare is broken. It's not broken. It is working exactly the way it was built to be with the HMO Act in the 1970s. I'm writing a book now, and we're doing a lot of digging into the origins of why it is the way it is. And it is doing exactly to a T what it's meant to do. And it will never, ever change until such time as it becomes a voter issue.
You bring me in mind to PBMs.
Yes.
Okay. They're the big culprit for those who may not know. Pharmacy benefit managers. These are the Optums. These are the people who show up on your bill when your doctor writes you a script and you're like, well, who are these people, right? They're the people who are the arbiters of how much drugs cost in the United States, and they are almost completely unregulated. That is until the state of Arkansas and the state of Texas intervened from a policy perspective and said, listen, pharmacy benefit managers, you can't deny access to some patients while giving preferred pricing to those pharmacies in your network, because you're creating disparities and you're running amok with denying access and no check imbalances in your pricing and things like that. You hit the nail on the head until it becomes a voter issue, until it becomes something that the public can weigh in on in their voices. And my point about United Healthcare, and you're right, that will probably never change. It is working exactly the way it's supposed to. I don't know how public can intervene, but as long as it's a net neutral, business, if we're talking about healthcare, more people get service. What do you think the future is with PBMs?
Well, if I take any cues from what Mark Cuban is throwing out there, they need to go away.
So tell me more about your thoughts around what Mark Cuban's proposition is.
This goes a little above my pay grade because I don't think billionaire very often. He is all about how do we make money by not screwing patients. I love just the idea that that is a thought of someone like him who is probably unbeknownst to him becoming a populist hero. He's literally Batmaning himself here and there, or Robin Hooding himself here and there to save people from PBMs and all sorts of shenanigans. I like the idea of who profits the most when patients get what they want. Is it possible for there to be tons of money, pro-corporate, pro-democracy, pro-patriotism, pro-everything, and patients don't just die from bureaucracy? Can there be tons of capitalism and patients get what they want and they need on their terms? What a beautiful hypothesis this is. I'll go back to my inflection point. We are at this moment in time, as of this recording, when they continue to decimate 30 years of advocacy and progress, destroying research, getting rid of science. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't left or right. This is the most purple issue. How do we look at patients as voters? Because I guarantee you, if there was a bill somewhere that said we're getting rid of PBMs, and you let every electorate in that state who was a cancer patient vote or, pack their way to support candidates, everyone would believe and follow, desperate for re-election, the constituents in that cancer block.
So now we're seeing different phenomenons happen that we can't necessarily put our finger on, but it's important to be a voter issue so voters, constituents, have power to affect the will of the people in terms of access to health care. You may remember Dr. Elizabeth Porter, breast surgeon in Austin, Texas.
Love her. Yeah. Have you spoken to her yet?
I haven't, but I do want to because
she's making the rounds.
Yes. So for those of you who may not know about Dr. Elizabeth Porter, follow her on TikTok. She's an excellent follower, breast surgeon in Austin, Texas. She went viral when she was in the midst of a surgery with a patient, and United Healthcare called her to question why that patient needed an overnight stay. To be fair, A lot of breast surgery procedures are outpatient procedures, but she was doing a particular extensive type of procedure that she's known for, and her patients do require overnight care. The whole issue of them calling her saying, hey, she had to leave the surgery with the patient on the table, intubated, sleep, to argue for payment for the procedure she was doing for this patient, which they actually didn't pay her. Now, here's the aftermath. So not only did they not pay her for that, she has a surgery center, and they denied her surgery center to be a healthcare providing facility. So they're not going to include her healthcare facility into their network. And she's a doctor. It's a surgery center. Again, they're the biggest in our country. And again, where's the power of the people to be able to affect this and say this is not right? Where is the oversight of these companies for someone who may be a public official or someone that says, you can't do that, you can't have a good reason to deny this person, access or to be a member of your network, especially when you have this kind of history. In what you're doing, in having your platform for years, what are kind of some of those memorable moments where you feel that either you or someone you've interviewed has been able to make positive change in affecting how patients get access to healthcare or platform for them to advocate for themselves?
Let me jump back for a sec, because I think what happened in Arkansas and what happened in North Carolina on these prior auth bills, these were not done with constituency. These were done in the House and in the Senate, autonomous of districts, because I think they're smelling what the rock is cooking, that there's a storm coming, and they need to appease the voters of their states now and remove these barriers to care. And I'm happy it's happening, and I think it's another sign of the times that we are ripe for a cancer rights revolution. If I had to point to, I'll say 3 that I could look back on the first was Stupid Cancer, which I give full credit to Livestrong, was a populist movement. Stupid Cancer changed the planet. It defined an entire generational need. It brought long-term pediatric survivorship into the mainstream. It forced guidelines, standards of care, best practices. It moved NCCN, it moved ASCA, it moved ONS, it moved genomics. We were the testing grounds for everything. And I'm so proud of that community. And it's still going strong. My successor is running a battleship. It's fantastic. The second one, of course, is ACA, which was a huge decade-long push. As imperfect as it was, as a young adult cancer survivor, being able to say insurance goes to 26 and pre-existing was gone was a cultural milestone for generations to come. I know they're trying to get rid of it now. They can go screw themselves. But the third, and this is brand new, a year ago, the Academy of Oncology Nurse Navigators pioneered the first reimbursable navigation codes in clinic. Cancer patient navigation is now reimbursable. How can people make money and help patients get what they want? That's a great example of, all right, you'll still make all your money, but now people will suffer less. What a great idea. Those 3 things are North Stars of what I'm proud of to say we have a footprint in. Is just yet another telltale sign that it's possible to do all of this if you think about it from a Mark Cuban perspective. I'm going to make a ton of money, but people are going to suffer less.
Mark Cuban's got the right idea.
I think so.
Well, and what we're talking about is classic disruption, right? Because disruption comes from the outside. Disruption comes from the people. It's Uber disrupting, taxi cabs. Here on Genetics for Healthcare, I love to tap into my guest experience and their view on how we can solve some of these issues. In this case, access to, genetic and genomic insights, but even more so, access into the type of care that they want, right? And so we have to provide platforms to let them know what's available. But what are 3 ways, I guess I would ask you, that we can cause disruption in access to healthcare, considering the things that we talk about for cancer patients, but in innovative healthcare in general with, the onset of genetics and genomic insights to help make decisions?
It's a nuanced answer, but I'll go back to the, was it Christmas 22 pandemic? The number one gift that year in the country was 23andMe. And that's a bad thing to say these days, but it was very trendy. the ancestry test, those were gifted. Americans, our culture was ready to embrace genetics for novelty. Did they know it was going to come? Of course not. And I think it was a huge step backwards with what happened with them. Getting the culture comfortable with knowing risk. We've gone from hunter-gatherers to complacent. We don't want to know our risk. Knowing that I'm half Nigerian and I like coffee, and then, that's different. That's novelty. Somehow we've escaped the fact that's still a version of risk. It's just not life-threatening risk. So how do we get from there to next, which is, I would argue, again, like the consumer presentability of genomic testing, like these methylate tests and these other variants that aren't necessarily predictors of cancer or predictors of disease. Should I eat certain plants because of my genetics? Should I have certain probiotics because of my genetics? Not that I'm allergic to coffee. We're moving in a direction that I think is going to lead towards the risk reduction of risk awareness. I think that's all three things. It's going to come down to risk reduction of risk awareness. And how is that presented to the general populace? And then how is it presented to niche, cultural, diverse audiences that have their own backstory of misperception and distrust?
Everything you just mentioned are my ambitions for genetics for healthcare. Coming behind pioneers like you just keep me motivated to get better at this craft, to talk to more people, to see what more can be done. I mean, you just dropped some jewels for me. I'm taking those jewels, and I really appreciate you offering them to our audience here on our podcast. When I was introducing you, there's so many superlatives and so much achievements in your background. I was going to introduce you as Binghamton University's finest. But that forced me to actually look up Binghamton University. Holy cow. What the hell's going on at Binghamton? The only person I knew that talked about it, because I love sports, was Tony Kornheiser from ESPN. But my goodness, the role of alumni from Binghamton University. Hakeem Jeffries, who's my fraternity brother, by the way, speaker, Democratic leader.
Yeah. He's my rep in Brooklyn.
Okay, boom. There you go, small world.
Tell him I said hi.
I will if I ever, come in contact with him. But Taylor Swift, her Back to December video was shot in Binghamton. I didn't know that, but probably your most famous, world famous alumni, somebody I don't know if you know, Rebecca Lee Longendijk, who was received her bachelor's in biochemical engineering, but she's been a little busy for med school because she's been on the cover of Vogue all over the world for the last couple of years.
I got Paul Reiser and Billy Baldwin too, so, okay, good company.
Amazing litany of alumni. Matthew Zachary, host of the Out of Patients podcast and Stupid Cancer Legacy. Thank you for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
An absolute pleasure, my friend. Thank you for having me.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.